After the ravages of the Clone Wars, the members of the former Separatist movement didn't just disappear. We've already discussed the complicated relationship between the Rebel Alliance and former Separatists, but today we're going to talk about what happened to the megacorporations who backed the CIS, either out in the open or behind the scenes. And some of the lore on this gets pretty weird, which is what made me want to do the video. We'll also be primarily focusing on the Legends continuity for today. We'll start with what's probably the biggest name, the Trade Federation. The Trade Federation were some of the earliest of the future Separatists to take military action in the lead-up to the Clone Wars, deploying their fleet to blockade the world of Naboo. But after the war, with the death of Rune Hako and Nute Gunray, the Federation was left fractured and effectively leaderless. A Neimoidian named Centipeth Findos became the acting viceroy, and despite attempting to resist the Empire on Neimoidia, his remaining forces were quickly overrun, and he was forced to sign a peace treaty handing over all Trade Federation resources to the Empire, nationalizing the organization, dismantling its remaining leadership structure, and according to the HoloNet News, likely distributing the seized assets to corporations who remained loyal to the Republic during the war, which usually meant to members of the new Corporate Sector Authority, whom we've covered in more detail in another prior video. The Corporate Sector Authority ended up being the big winners of the dissolution of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. In the Commerce Guild, for example, the death of Gossam President Shu Mai led to a very similar fate. But this time we do know for sure that assets and even some employees and members explicitly made their way to the corporate sector. Yako Stark had been involved in not one but two rebellions against the Republic, with both the Clone Wars and the earlier Stark Hyperspace War, before he was able to find refuge in the corporate sector as a former member of the Commerce Guild. Getting the Commerce Guild assets meant the Corporate Sector Authority ended up with a lot of the recusant class. The Corporate Alliance, formerly led by Pascal Argent, was similarly dissolved with little fanfare, contributing Persuader-class enforcers and probably some fantails to the corporate sector as well. But going back to the Trade Federation, the treaty with Findos didn't end the organization entirely. Some shell of the Trade Federation would exist under the authority of the Senate until its own dissolution, but a lot of pockets of armed resistance did still remain as well. Customs Vizier Moroth Voru established himself and his forces on the mid-rim planet of Enarch, and decried Findos as an illegitimate third-rate flunky, daring Palpatine to take his worlds from him and his droids, and so, well, Palpatine took Voru's worlds from him and his droids. Grand Moff Octavian Grant, who would later become a Grand Admiral, led the Imperial forces against Voru's holdouts in the Five Veils campaign, eliminating most of the holdouts at Farstein before capturing Voru himself in the Hook Nebula. Other officers and Trade Federation holdouts continued this kind of opposition for years, including a bunch of Neimoidians on Naboo for some reason in Star Wars Galaxies. But there's also former members of the Trade Federation leadership like Blox Hatha, who raided Imperial forces with his own holdouts for decades. As a card-carrying Separatist, he was never officially allowed into the Rebel Alliance, but he was hired by the Alliance as a privateer. Most interesting though, and one of the two things which made me want to make this video, is a blurb from the Dark Empire Handbook, which claims the Neimoidian species as a whole barely survived and then renamed themselves to the Duros. The Neimoidians were essentially a descendant cousin species of the Duros, so they were very close related. Neimoidians tend to just look like slightly greener Duros with hats. But the idea that the species basically just had such a bad reputation in the galaxy and were so widely hated from the Clone Wars that they all just claimed to not be part of that species anymore is certainly an interesting take on explaining why Neimoidians don't turn up in basically any of the post-Endor books. The real-world explanation, of course, being that Neimoidians didn't exist until the prequel trilogy was made. Once they had been introduced, though, we actually did start getting some more Neimoidians who weren't identifying themselves as their Duros cousins. In the New Jedi Order books, Jaina Solo has a Neimoidian squadron member in her twin son squadron named Vale. And then there are a few other appearances later on, so Neimoidians are still out there. All in all, it's a pretty major fall from being one of the biggest powers in the galaxy to being essentially non-existent for the Neimoidians in the Trade Federation. And while at first glance it would seem like the Techno Union and Banking Clan, as the other two largest backers of the CIS, would meet the same fate as the Commerce Guild, Corporate Alliance, and Trade Federation, we actually do have evidence to the contrary for both. For the Techno Union, the evidence is a bit thinner than for the Banking Clan. There is, to my knowledge at least, only one appearance of the Techno Union itself after the Clone Wars, and it's a very minor one. In the game Empire at War Forces of Corruption, when playing as the Zon Consortium, you're able to send missions to corrupt planets and gain benefits from them. One of the planets in the game is Mustafar, and in the flavor text for the bribery mission there, it says, "Forces of the Techno Union own large portions of the planet. The Zen Consortium has bribed members of the Techno Union before." So the Techno Union is around in at least some capacity by the end of the Galactic Civil War, around the time of Yavin and Endor. If you succeed in the mission, one of the Consortium agents tells you, quote, "As expected, we have successfully bribed the Techno Union officials. Droids from this world will no longer be manufactured to aid our enemies in this sector," end quote. So we can take that to mean that they've essentially remained as a manufacturer of droids for the Empire. With the banking clan, we have a bit more information. Historically, since at least the early days of the Republic, the Muns of the banking clan had been an integral part of galactic finance. Despite Chairman Sandhill signing Dooku's treaty, we see the actual banking clan support was somewhat covert, much like how the Trade Federation would pretend, convincingly or not, that the forces under Newt Gunray were a rogue element of the Trade Federation, until it became too obvious to everyone that that really just wasn't the case. Both of these organizations were entirely behind the CIS. Dealings by banking clan Senator Rush Clovis would expose the extent of the banking clan's involvement beyond the open double dealing it was doing. But even within the Republic and then the Empire, there were too many financial ties which relied on the banking clan, so forcing them out entirely was seen as untenable. Almost as untenable as not liking this video and subscribing for more. Despite being known to be in full cooperation with the Separatists, the banking clan were therefore kept intact by the Empire to a far greater degree than any other mega corporations that we know of after the Clone Wars. Where the Trade Federation was split up and either sold off or put under direct control of the Senate, the banking clan was still nominally under the rule of the Core Five, a governing body of financial moguls which had controlled the banking clan before. In reality, of course, Palpatine had taken control of the Central Vaults, but that was pretty much true of everything else in the galaxy at that point. Palpatine just controlled it. The Muns were able to continue their banking operations as before, but now under the watchful eye of the Imperials, namely Moff Boyce and his flagship the Exchequer, which was about as effective at preventing dealings with the Empire's enemies as direct regulations would have been anyways. Away from the immense and well-known main vaults on the planet Scipio, many within the banking clan balked under the Empire's control as they had under the far more lax Republic. A network of canyons and tunnels below became home to secret dealings and massive amounts of untraceable credits, available to those who would oppose the Imperial control of the banks. It wasn't unheard of during the Imperial period for bounty hunters or wayward Force sensitives hiding from the Empire to pose as government officials and executives, working for the banking clan in an attempt to earn credits and make their way through the war. But even following Endor, the banking clan remained within Imperial territory. The clan was still intact, and happily financed both the Imperial Remnant and, when it became impossible for the Remnant to stop them, the New Republic as well. A financial expert named Lord Grayman from Munilinst was in close contact with the Imperial government, given how important Munilinst was to the shrinking Imperial territory, implying at least some kind of direct working relationship between the banking clan and the Empire. The weird part here is that this gets established before the Muns are a species, and before the banking clan exists in the Hand of Thrawn duology. But the character of Greymon is described as lean and wearing traditional Munilinst clothing, which makes him a fairly safe retcon as actually being a Mun, though of course your mileage may vary on how much credence you want to lend that. It was never officially retconned into being the case, but I think implicitly it makes enough sense. The other possible interpretation is that the Empire still took more and more control over the banks and then was placing other humans in charge. Like most of the galaxy, the planets of the banking clan suffered heavily during the Yuuzhan Vong War, particularly Munilinst. But I guess the flip side of that is that at least they survived long enough to suffer in the Yuuzhan Vong War. They did manage to fully recover, and they're still around by the time of the Legacy period, which is the latest published period in the Star Wars Legends continuity, remaining an important part of the galaxy's financial landscape. So their ending is overall a bit less sad than some of the other fates for the CIS corporations. I mentioned that there were two reasons I wanted to do this video though, one being the handbook note about the Neimoidians. The second is that I've been reading an early review copy of The Mask of Fear by Alexander Freed, an upcoming novel about the early days of the Empire and the Canon continuity, and without spoiling anything, it touches on some of these post-Clone War outcomes in a way that I don't think Star Wars has ever really wrestled with. And I found it really interesting and compelling. I'll do a full review when I'm finished with the book, but it's already probably among my favorite Star Wars books. That's going to do it for today though. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Remember to leave a like and subscribe for more if so, and thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time.